Good morning. Today on Wired's live living room sessions, we are pivoting a bit and looking at climate change and resilience from a different but not unusual angle. Climate change requires a multidisciplinary approach, and as an organization, Wired believes that the creative sector has a critical role to play. As we tackle climate change issues, incorporating the voices from the creative sector allows us to accomplish this, helping the collective to form identities as positive environmental change makers. Today is the first, but certainly not the last, of a series of interviews with climate champions from the creative sector, starting with renowned Barbadian artist Taisha Carrington. As a multidisciplinary artist working in performance, sculpture, body adornment, and writing, Taisha's work has been eloquently communicating on how the gap between art and climate change can be bridged. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Keisha Farnham, and this is Wired's live living room sessions, where every Tuesday at 1 p.m. and Thursday at 11 a.m., we are creating a space for disruptive and innovative conversations on climate change, biodiversity, regenerative agriculture, and renewable energy. These sessions are brought to you by Walker's Institute for Regenerative Research, Education, and Design, WIRED, in collaboration with our education partners, the Caribbean Permaculture Research Institute, and powered by the Inter-American Development Bank. Let's launch straight into today's discussion. Taisha, welcome. It's great to have you on today's session.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yes, definitely. We're so excited to have you. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, so you covered it pretty well, summing up what a multidisciplinary artist is. I practice in various media, whatever it takes to tell the story I need to tell, discuss the topic we need to discuss, like the one we're discussing today. I grew up in Barbados. I've lived here all my life except for college. And I've returned and I saw the threat posed to us by climate change and other factors. And I use my art to address that. That's me in a nutshell. And I'm hoping that I'll throw some more out there as we get a little bit deeper into our lives today.
Well, Taisha, let's launch into the discussion. As we look at climate change, a lot of the rigorous science has been out there for a while. Scientists have been talking about it. But up until recently, it really wasn't on a lot of people's radars. It wasn't something that people took seriously. And so, we understand that even though rigorous science has its place, of course, and it's very important, it is important in the way that we communicate that science to persons, right? How do we reach communities? How do we reach individuals? And in reaching communities and individuals, we're then able to create meaningful change, right? And so I guess that segues really nicely into our first question. And so that is, what are some of the challenges in communicating the impacts of climate change to Barbados publics? And what role does the creative sector play in addressing these challenges, in catalyzing resilient action?
Well, I think you outlined the problem there in your question is how do we make it seem more immediate? I think one of the major problems we face generally globally, but particularly in Barbados, is that it is very hard the problem is not visible. Bridgetown is not on fire. There aren't dead fish all over the sea, the beaches. The long lines outside of PriceSmart are not because of climate change. There's nothing immediately impacting our life that we can see right now and feel forced to act on. That's the role of art, is to then come in there and make it visible. Say, hey, this is happening. Are you even aware that it's happening? And if not, let's talk about it. How is it impacting you? How is it going to impact your children or the future generations? And how can we go about partnering to find ways of resilience, to find ways to continue to inform others of what exactly is happening to our island specifically, because we're the ones on the front line of this climate crisis, and what is happening globally and how you can be a part of it. A second problem is usually that climate change can feel bigger than us, or it can very often feel like this is something that my one little me taking up that plastic bottle ain't making no difference. It's just one bottle. But the way I look at it is, it takes 1 million grains of sand to build a beach, or a house is built with 1 million different bricks. Collective effort is the fundamental that we need to push here in terms of climate change. Yes, you might just be collecting one bottle. You might be planting one parsley herb in your kitchen or whatever. But you really do need to put the emphasis on the individual. And I think art has a great way of doing that, because it can become very personal. And it usually isn't in a format that addresses masses, like a speech, or it could be, or, something that addresses a huge crowd.
Yeah.
It might be an intimate gallery setting, or in my case, it's an intimate performance where maybe there are 25 people that gather. And then after we present our findings on what is happening, we go ahead and discuss it. And it's that individual connection that makes it seem like, hey, there's a part I can play here in this larger picture.
Yeah.
So I'd say feeling important in the larger picture is a significant part of what art can do and is doing right now. And we need to continue to do it.
Yeah, I think, for a lot of persons, the science is scary. For those who choose to listen, it's actually a bit overwhelming.
It is.
Right? It's all of this information from all these different sectors, and it all feels like, oh my gosh, doom, gloom,
Yeah.
Whereas, being able to communicate that message through art, through a medium that is pleasurable, right? To bring something, to bring awareness to a subject. It definitely, as you said, takes it from being this huge insurmountable thing to a very personal level in terms of how I can act, right? As an individual. What can I do as an individual? I think this is a beautiful opportunity for you to start talking about your saltwater project. And we're going to put up on the screen one of the elements of that project, because there's several installments of this project. We won't be able to get to all of them today, but definitely in the link to Taisha's bio, and when we have the recording up, you would see the link to be able to go to her website and look at the various installments of this project. We're just going to talk about a few of those installments today. And so we're going to start off with this one. So Taisha, give us an idea of what we're looking at here, please.
Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of background on the project, and then I'll bring you around town to get to this one.
Yes.
So in early 2019, I returned home and I started to pivot my practice more towards observing what was happening in relation to climate change and our current situation as a country. So I started wanting to reestablish my connection with Barbados in whatever way I could. That included meeting new people, finding new places to source my food, growing my own food, finding my art materials from the land, and so on. So fast forward a little bit now, the role of the Saltwater Project was to really not only reestablish for myself the connection with Barbados, but to help others to get involved in that process as well. So what you're looking at here is what I call a ecosphere reliquary. And what I was thinking when making it, or it's a very long experiment, and this is one of the last iterations so far. The aim was to condense the environment around us into one small bite-sized observable object. And what happens in this reliquary is that there is salt water. There's a basin at the bottom that I fill with salt water that I collect from the coast. And that salt water is placed in the sun, evaporates and condenses, and it all then rolls down into these little garden beds that you can see there. And from those garden beds, plants will grow. So what I'm trying to do is insert you into this bigger picture of what is happening. This stuff is going on around us all the time. Right now, the water is evaporating from the ocean, it's condensing, the rain is falling, it's coming down, it's watering the plants. I pick guavas every morning because of the rain. It all comes together, but you never really stop sometimes and pay attention to this cycle. And it's that connection that I'm trying to establish between us, the people, and the lands that we occupy. And this was a way of doing it and making it, as you mentioned before, it's, a digestible, smaller format of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Could you repeat the name of what it is?
This one is, I call it an ecosphere reliquary. And the idea of the reliquary comes from holding something sacred. And in this case, it is water.
Right.
And I think that then leads into what we'll probably touch on very soon, which is water scarcity and the role we play in that bigger picture as well.
Yeah, just looking at something like this and seeing it's such a huge education tool as well. I can see something like this within a school, teaching a science lesson, and the kids gathered around it, and very keenly, very easily being able to understand the process that's being described to them because they're seeing it right before their eyes. Again, showing how art can not only be creative and beautiful, but it can also be a huge education tool as well.
Exactly. That's the aim of a project like this, that it taps into the STEAM stream, science, technology, engineering, and math aspect of everything, and really highlights the interdisciplinary nature of art and how the artist can take these things and bring it to younger people who might not be able to understand, the children, even older people, or people who are in completely
older people. Exactly. When you explained it to me, I was like, "What is this?" And then you explained it to me, right?
I see it as, I call it like people science. It's not very hard to understand, and it's all right there in front of you. And it's not meant to solve bigger problems per se, but it for sure does highlight our ability to desalinate water. We have a desalination plant. It draws attention to water scarcity, as I mentioned, and food scarcity. And how can we combine these elements to maybe work with one another? How do I just spark that idea in somebody to go off thinking about this? It's the real aim of the work that I would do.
Well, the reality is, to be able to solve complex problems, you need to understand the underlying foundation, right?
Exactly.
Climate change is a complex problem. So in being able to understand an underlying concept that you're presenting here, it then allows you to move to a higher order, right? You can then think about bigger things once you understand the underlying concept. Yeah. So, as we talk about understanding underlying concepts, one of the things about the work that we're doing at Walker's Reserve, and the work that we're doing as Wired, is that we look very heavily towards permaculture and permaculture principles in the way that we operate, in the way that we reform the land. And, art promotes observation, right? And looks at things holistically.
Yeah.
Right? Permaculture does the same thing, right? And so for me, I think my question to you would be, in your mind, how do you see art paralleling permaculture principles? And do you see an overlap between the two of them? Do you see a way that they synchronize well together?
For sure. Let me say that investigating permaculture is actually how I came to discover Wired and understand that there was somebody here doing this kind of work in Barbados and trying to establish, these are the ideas. How do I share this with people? How do we create alliances to strengthen each other? And stumbled across Wired. I was like, oh, this is perfect. Permaculture perfectly laid out all the ways that art tries to address society at large. How is everything a little bit closed loop? How is it inclusive? How is it fruitful? How is it educational? And how do we do this in somewhat of the most pleasurable manner? And the one that I can distinctly point out is, and to just outline the principles, is obtaining a yield. And in permaculture, when you're thinking of the farming aspect, you might most likely think obtaining a yield is picking your fruit, getting lumber for buildings or whatever. But there are also important things that aren't tangible that I feel like art works with heavily, which is simple things like happiness. Nobody wants to farm if they're not happy, or climate change becomes a lot more daunting if you don't have something every day that gives you a little bit of, joy, a little bit of push. And I think that is one of the main underlying principles that art shares with permaculture. But also, artists love to reuse things, and that really taps into the renewable and recyclable aspect of the permaculture principles.
Yeah,
a lot of the things I build, like I find wood around my house, maybe from past construction that's just been laying around, or a piece of pipe, or there's honestly never the right thing in a hardware store for an artist. So when I can rig up something at home and I find it, again, down to the individual, I'm recycling, I'm reusing, I'm repurposing, which are some of the fundamentals of the permaculture principles. Right. So because of that, I am like, this is ideal as an underpinning for almost like a laying out of a plan of how to approach the artistic practice, the art pieces themselves, and then also the practice. How do I take the practice into the public? How do they become a part of the work? How do they reap benefits from it as well? It's not just, paint something and hang it there, or in my bedroom or something, I'm looking in ways to incorporate everyone. And when you look at the larger picture as well, that's what happens with music, film, crop over, all these cultural elements. They share very similar underpinnings with permaculture and this holistic approach to how we benefit as people in a place.
Yeah, a lot of your work speaks to reestablishing the bond with nature, and examining how we can learn from it, how we can learn from the environment. And I want to introduce the collage that's going to come up on the screen. And I would like you to talk about the significance of that work, which is that this is another element of your saltwater project. That we've kind of pieced together so that we can have it all on the screen together. But if you could just run us through what your process was here and what it is that you're trying to speak to in these pictures.
So this project spanned over, I'd say, maybe an 8-month period. And as I mentioned before, it the beginning of the saltwater period, it started with me trying to reestablish that connection with the land. So I had this idea to, how can I harvest the land, harvest the water, and harvest the sun, and then use it to preserve my existence here, or preserve my new state of being after having interacted with the entire island. So the top left picture that you're seeing is me collecting clay down on the East Coast, which I then go ahead and refine all the way down till I make clay bowls. So again, we're using natural materials. I then use those bowls to collect seawater. And in a very slow process, it usually takes about 14 days, I allow the sun to evaporate the water and leave the salt behind. And I continuously would add water from each different beach that I would go to around the island on my exploration, until I ended with a pile of salt. Then I was ready to do a performance where I invited others to come to the beach with me. And I used this salt to put on my body as an act of preservation after having gone through this 8-month period of interacting with Barbados, where I've always lived, but I've never looked at in the way I looked at it for those 8 months. And I've never considered, how fragile we are and how vulnerable we are as a country. So I really wanted, it's basically like, we might really lose what we have happening here. So how do I hang on to it? How do I actively play a role in going out there and, enjoying what is there while it is still there? Yeah. And then that is what I brought to the performance. And through a poem that the participants would have read, we then all covered our bodies with the salt, and we opted to go into the water and reconnect with the land on your own terms, however you saw it, however you wanted it to be. And I went ahead and did that as well. And 2 others volunteered with me. And it truly was a really nice experience that brought the beginning of the project to an end and has facilitated how the project has been rolling on now.
Right, excellent. If you're just joining us for the first time, you are listening to Wired's live living room sessions. We are here with Taisha Carrington, a multidisciplinary artist, a Barbadian, a climate change champion, and we are discussing the connection between the creative sector, between art and in its various forms, with climate change and catalyzing climate resilience. Segueing into that whole community aspect of your performance, and just to be, your performance is available on your website, yes?
Yeah, snippets of it is available.
All right, so perfect. So once after this is finished and we have the recording up, you will have a link to Taisha's website. You can go and check it out and understand more about the performance. Moving into that whole aspect of community and getting others involved. The 8 forms of capital that was coined by Ethan Roland and Gregory Landua, who were with us actually last week in the live living room sessions. It introduces the concept of cultural capital, right? And cultural capital is usually quite often overlooked because, financial capital, intellectual capital, it's much easier to identify. It can be held or owned by a single person, but cultural capital can only be gathered by a community of people, right? It is a collective thing. And so in linking that concept to your own work, my next question would then be, even though it is often overlooked, why is cultural capital important in shaping the climate change narrative? And what are the benefits from ensuring that it's harnessed?
Well, cultural capital is something that the Caribbean does pretty well, but perhaps does not harness pretty well.
Exactly. I think I agree with you there.
Yeah. And just for a little clarity, I'd go ahead and sum it up as, cultural capital is like, songs, storytelling, rituals, or religion, and all these things that bring together a sense of community, things that aren't particularly, you can't have it and give it away. It exists because of a collective. And as you pointed out with the work that I previously described, that is the aim. How do we bring persons together as a collective and share that collective experience with include Barbados, the land, and not just the people in that collective. But I lost my train of thought with cultural capital. Art inherently addresses many of the aspects that Gregory and Ethan would have outlined, including spiritual, cultural, and even financial capital. And where I mentioned we have trouble harnessing it is because a lot of emphasis is not placed on the importance of art. And even last night, our Prime Minister commented on the other forms of tourism that we have, sports tourism, education tourism, and we don't really have the art tourism. I think this is where we can really tap into our cultural capital. And right now, our orange economy really needs growing. Art is a massive facilitator of this. The Caribbean is known well for its music. Some other islands are known quite well for their visual arts and their theater arts and their film and so on. How do we go about harnessing that to promote this agenda that we have and diversify our tourism product firstly, but also cater to the people that are here? How do we share it with them? How do they benefit from this type of capital that somewhat can't be taken away from them? How do we magnify that? And the role of art is to provide the fertile ground for these communities to form and to facilitate this cultural capital. Artists really are just the conduits to which, if an artist produces a song, then that song reaches millions of people, and that reach brings together hundreds of people around, again, like crop over time, or even around Christmas time, the feeling you get in town. Those are the things that come along with cultural capital and the things that we need to focus on in the arts and bring together a little more tightly.
Yeah. And, for a lot of local artists across the Caribbean, not just Barbados, a lot of them have turned to using their fame, their platforms to send a message about critical issues, and it has been very effective. They have put up themselves as role models for the youth who follow them very closely. So even in that aspect, there is a role for artists. There is a role for musicians, for those in the creative sector to be able to guide, particularly young people who look up to them in terms of what example am I setting? What are the messages that I'm sending out to my audience? What am I encouraging people to do? in Trinidad, anybody who knows me knows that I absolutely adore Carnival. And
Mm-hmm.
when I moved to Barbados,
Mm-hmm.
I have not missed a crop over since. Even last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it was like, yes, 2 carnivals in 1 year. This is amazing, right? But the whole movement, and it has really encouraged me to see that happening in Trinidad, and also now see it happening in Barbados, where event promoters, our cultural icons, they're talking about going green, and making sure that our fats are greener, and looking at how we can recycle stuff, and looking at community involvement and community work. Brands in Trinidad have done a fantastic job of doing that, and they're getting better and better at it. And they're definitely to be applauded. So I think there's an awakening that's happening.
Yes.
Where we're transitioning from, because you're so right, we do it well. We've been able to, out of the ashes of colonialism, we've been able to rise up as communities and create our own unique culture. Because each Caribbean country, we do have a lot of similarities, but we also have those unique elements that are us, that are an expression of our collective, and definitely we've been able to be able to show that to the world, but we haven't truly harnessed it in a way, either in some cases financially, but also in terms of the messages that we send with our creativity. So definitely there's a lot of room for it, and it is a very exciting topic that we definitely can't unpack all of it today.
No, but I do want to touch on 2 things that you said. And it would be the last point you made about how do we use this platform that we already have to promote these messages. And a lot of that still comes down to being informed and communicating. So even as the artists have responsibilities to the other artists to share this information. It's like, hey, have you considered, discussing this issue in your creative form? How do we come together as artists? How maybe is there someone singing at a performance, and then that person's face becomes associated with climate resilience? And then you also mentioned the role that the influence that persons have in the world of social media. It really is impactful. And what artists often do is they may have work, yes, but they live an entire life of what they are working on. So even if you follow this artist on social media, you might see that the person has, a kitchen garden. And in these COVID times, I've seen a mass uprising of kitchen gardens, which I am so happy about. Everybody is planting something, because the problem has just become very real about the possibility of food scarcity. And digressing a little bit, but that really, I think the whole pandemic really gives us a touch of what we can expect with climate change, which I'm hoping as an artist here now to harness and say, hey, look, you've experienced it. This is what, sorry to sound doom and gloom, but this is what is to come on a much larger scale with the threats of climate change. How do we do something now about it? You've already started. You've already seen how you can impact. And by getting everybody involved, then those people who are influencers or who have some sphere of influence, whether it be just their family, whether it be their friends, or whether it be thousands of people if they're a DJ or something, you have reach. And how do you capitalize on that reach that you have?
Yeah, and I think you segued really well into the next question, because it's looking at environmental education through art and design as a form of experiential learning, right? How do we use that to develop an understanding, a care, a responsibility for the environment? I know that in my discussions with you, you've repeatedly said that resilience requires creativity.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a very simple statement, but it's also a very powerful statement. And so my question to you would be, how does art help to catalyze creative thinking and innovation to build climate resilience?
Well, to solve a problem, chances are the problem exists because there is a lack of creativity to figure out the solution. Our education system, which I'm a part of and value very dearly, does fall a little bit short on including arts in the curriculums. in a solid way across the board at all schools, and giving children access to creative thinking. Without creative thinking, you're just repeating what John Brown did. This worked for John Brown, and John Brown did not fix the problems that we have today. So how do we go about pushing creativity as a serious measure and a serious to be taken seriously in the larger scheme of education? And we even touched on it earlier when we mentioned STEAM or STREAM. It shows, first of all, that there's a crossover between these disciplines, and art isn't just a hobby, something that you put off that can't solve problems. No, art solves problems all the time, and even those people who think they can't paint, or the things that we classify as what you deem to be art. It goes beyond that. It goes down to the creative thinking. How do you as an individual develop that skill the same way you develop a skill like critical thinking? We aren't born critical thinkers. You do a little bit of math, you do a little bit of music, and those skills develop. It's the same way with creative skills. And I think stronger, more robust programs that push creativity and emphasize the role of creativity in our societies and in problem solving and in our larger capital, the role it can play in our capital, whether it be cultural or financial capital. How do we solidify this message? And it simply starts by allowing access to creativity in schools, in communities. And that's not to throw it off on some organization or the government to do, but it's also down to the artists, to get involved in your community, get involved in your family, get involved in a school, get involved in partnerships that foster these exchanges of creative thinking, and open the box on what art is and what creativity is and how it is useful to moving forward generally, but particularly in the face of climate change. As a region that, we're different to many other regions. We don't share the same problems. So it's usually down to the people that are here, who live it, who know it, to determine, how do we fix it? Because other nations are a little hesitant to hear what our real problems are as small island developing states. How do we go about saying, hey, I live here, this is the problem, and I have a solution for it. And here's the solution. And how do we pass that on to the generations that will experience it more than us? How do they grow up as creative thinkers to employ that knowledge and that bravery to help contribute, again, the individual to help contribute to this larger problem?
Talking about what you're saying about in terms of creative thinking and stimulating creative thinking within young people, my mind went to one of our programs that we launched late last year into this year, called the Art for Trees.
Yes.
And Art for Trees is part of the One Tree for Every Bayesian project, that's being funded by the Cable and Wireless Foundation and done in partnership with other organizations, other private sector organizations across Barbados. And one of the really interesting things that I noticed as we started to do Art for Trees, so the concept of Art for Trees is that we have groups of people, and we try to make sure that we got a very broad reach. So we had a huge program with Sheraton Mall for their 30th anniversary, where we brought the Art for Trees into the mall and had just anybody who wanted to join just come and join. But then we've also been doing targeted sessions with youth groups, with special interest groups, women groups, private sector organizations. And the one thing that I've noticed, and the rhetoric that I keep hearing is, when people sit before that canvas to start doing the artwork, they immediately wait for instructions, and when the artist says to them, I want you to put on this canvas what Barbados means to you, what planting trees means to you, what the environment means to you, there is that absolute moment of pause, panic, and we're talking about adults, right? Like, what do you mean there's no instructions? What do you mean I need to come up with this myself? And then there's just that kind, and the artist says, no, it's all right. There's no right, there's no wrong. You just need to think about this, and you come up with your own ideas. And if you need guidance along the way, I'm here, right? And people start to draw. And I mean, if you visit the Instagram page of Art for Trees, the creative imagination of Barbadians is fantastic. You know, the people who complain about, oh, I can't draw, I can't do this. I mean, I participated in it myself, and I loved art at school. You know, I did a lot of abstract art. I'm by no stretch of the imagination a professional artist, right? I do a lot of doodling and stuff like that. But I too was for a moment just paralyzed by, you know, I wanted to look really good. I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to be good enough, you know. And then I started to rack my brain. What does this mean to me? What, you know, what do I think about? And it opened this whole, you know, sets of questions in my head. And I know that it has done that for other people who've participated. And then you look at the kids who've participated in the process, and they are, okay, you want me to draw what Barbados means to me? No problem. Draw. And they have that creativity. And so the thing is, we really do need to look at how we continue to use art to harness that creativity, keep that creativity, and not stamp it out of them as it's been done for adults, right? But then again, you know, that program in such a small way has been able to just open up people. And then at the end of the process too, they're like, you know, I never really thought about it in this way. And now I have all these questions. And now I want to plant a tree. And now I want my friends to plant a tree. And now I'm thinking about, you know, this whole plastic ban thing, like, okay, there's something to this. Or, you know, it's just opening up all of these thoughts at an individual level that they then go and implement at home. Right. And so really looking at how we can, for me, the lessons learned from this is how could we involve private sector? Because this is a private sector funded art project that's related to environmentalism. So thank you to, you know, the Cable and Wireless Foundation and Flow. But how could the private sector now play a role in funding some of these types of activities that on the surface may not seem super impactful? What are the outcomes? What are this? You know, does it does it change the climate? Does it do that? No, it may not solve the big problems, but it's unlocking people at the fundamental level, right? So they're opening up at the fundamental level, and they're like, okay, I could change my actions here. I could do that. I could do that. I could do that. So I really, you know, it really is a journey. It's an exciting journey.
Yes, it definitely is.
It's an exciting journey.
One of the benefits.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the benefits to what you just touched on about getting the private sector involved is that you kind of kill two birds with one stone when it comes to art and climate change. These are two massive areas we need to focus on in the Caribbean. Climate change for obvious reasons, but as a spin-off of climate change, even if you needed more convincing, we need to, as I mentioned before, diversify our economies and find other ways to not just depend on mostly on tourism, because we see where, you know, that can leave us overnight. How do you then fund projects that address both of these things in very visible ways, because both of them need visibility? And then one other point you made earlier that I really wanted to touch on was the dissemination of art, and how anybody, artists or not, can become a central point for dissemination. Like the children you mentioned, or the adults who for a second had to pause and have that second of introspection to first realign themselves, ask themselves questions, and determine where they do stand in this conversation on climate change. And then go ahead and go home and share that, like, Mommy, you never tell me that, you know, XYZ, or did you know XYZ?
Yeah.
And then mother would be like, oh, well, I didn't know. And they might share it with another child. And it's this back again to the individual level of how this issue needs to be addressed. And also summed up in what you said as well, you mentioned, sorry, I lost track of what I was going to say. you mentioned earlier the role of when children interact and then see the possibilities. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
That's okay. But you know, because there's so many ideas, right? So many ideas. So many things are like zipping through your head of like, oh my gosh, this, that. But what I will do before we go into questions from the audience, because we've monopolized the conversation and I know the audience is itching to ask questions. But there is one thing that I do want to ask you before we move into questions from the audience, which is, you know, what message do you want to leave with local and regional artists and with climate change policymakers in the Caribbean?
To local and regional artists, for sure. I'm hoping that today alone set a tone for how we can interact across disciplines, across different sectors in our society. And also touching on what we were just speaking about funding from the private sector. How do we make ourselves desirable, more desirable? Continue to push, continue to explore the very important issues that are creating the world we live in today. How do we bring our art to the foreground and make it be like, hey, look at this. This is important. This is very necessary in what is happening here. And we need to band together and continue to produce work that merits support. To the policymakers, I think I covered it earlier. Do not ignore the importance of art in leading any global movement. So far in the past, it has not worked. There is not any pivotal moment in history that has not been propelled by art, supported by art, or at the very least being documented by art. And that holds true for what we face with climate change and the dangers that come with it. How do we use art as a means to preserve where we are now, but also preserve the history? History is being formed every day. How are the artists who are existing in the time collecting that data and putting it into artwork? Focus on that. See how they become the cultural producers and see how they become the community leaders in taking you in the direction that we need to go to become more climate resilient and more prepared for climate change.
Yeah, definitely. If you're just joining us, we are having a scintillating conversation with Taisha Carrington on bridging the gap between art and climate change. And definitely, this has been a very exciting conversation. I know that we have questions from the audience. You can join us here every Tuesday at 1 p.m. and every Thursday at 11 a.m. as we discuss, you know, very pertinent topics around climate change, renewable energy, biodiversity conservation, and regenerative agriculture. Taisha is the first of the creative sector that we're interviewing, but definitely we will have some other creative elements of the creative sector coming to this session. We have Annalise Davis coming up, and we have Israel Mapp also coming up in future, so stay tuned. We're going to move to questions from the audience. So if we can have the first question from the audience. Let's see. So Patrick is asking, what is the missing link that allows us to value Caribbean art more? And what about value climate change more? What about both together?
A lot of the missing link for valuing Caribbean art, sadly, is funding of the arts. It is very hard to continue doing something, investing your time, which it requires a lot of, and not be financially supported. And in the Caribbean, that is what mostly cuts down most artists very young in their careers. And then it just becomes a side thing that you do, or you just can't focus on it the way that you would focus on any other career that needs building. You know, if you're a cricketer, you probably play cricket 5 days a week. If you want to make the West Indies team, you know, there's a commitment from a very young age that is needed. And we mentioned that earlier, you know, greater presence of the role of art in schools and creative thinking, and in communities. By strengthening that, you start to place a higher value on art, which I think is what is lacking, the value of art to people, the average individual, but also to governments and larger entities. How do we magnify the role that art has to play in our societies. That is definitely what is holding us back with Caribbean art. There are countries like Jamaica, Cuba, and even Trinidad, who are good examples of capitalizing on their art. Trinidad Carnival is a beautiful display and a mastery of so much creativity and art across all media. You know, you have the music, which is the core of it, the costumes, all of that, all falls under to the art, all falls under the arts. And how do we need to go about focusing more heavily on that, because we are a very cultural capital dependent region. That cultural capital feeds in so much into what our tourism product is. How many people come to Barbados and say, I really choose Barbados because the people are so friendly. It's just something about the place. That something is the art. It's the cultural factor. And a greater emphasis needs to be placed on that. And by emphasis, I mean support as well, on the part of external persons supporting artists, and on artists reaching out to other groups who are not artists or who are not involved in the arts in any very obvious way. And the value of climate change, I'd say in Barbados specifically, it just hasn't hit us yet. Like some of our neighbors who have the very rude wake-up call of being hit and devastated by a hurricane and having not even being able to inhabit islands anymore because of hurricanes, you know, having to completely move, having your life disrupted entirely. That's why I mentioned earlier that I feel like this pandemic does give us a bit of a peephole into what life could be like after a catastrophic event, which climate change has made possible. So I'd say greater focus on that is very important for the work we need to do.
Yeah, excellent. Do we have any more questions from the audience? All right, so the next question is from Jennifer Clark, and it's, what about creative spaces? Do we have the designated spaces in the Caribbean? And how can having spaces allocated to artistic expression, help the climate narrative?
From my knowledge, which is, I don't want to say limited, but it's not extensive, we do not have a lot of spaces for the arts. Or frequently, I should say. It might be all condensed into one part of the year, you know, where you have NIFCA, a wonderful display of all the disciplines in very concise areas. You might have a night of theater. For myself, a major problem I have is a creative space or a studio that gives me access to, you know, things needed to make art outside of two-dimensional art. And I know that is not my problem alone, and that extends across most local artists. So it then starts to narrow down the kind of art you can create. And then by shifting the art, you kind of shift how you're able to communicate with others. If you wanted to do a performance and you didn't have the space or the means to do it, then you just don't do a performance and you don't reach those people and you don't build that community. So creative spaces are important. There are lots of people advocating for creative spaces, but to be honest, there has been limited investment in creative spaces, to put it lightly, but it is very, very important. And how can having spaces allocated to art expression help the climate narrative? Well, as I mentioned, it just gives space to shoot out there what is happening. You know, if an artist who records a film has an audience to show it to, you know, in a theater, then that art reaches persons and informs them about the climate crisis. Or if I wanted to do a dance, if I was a dancer, where am I performing? Am I just waiting on July and August to do this performance? You know, how can I do it throughout the year? By giving those spaces, you are using the art to push climate change.
Yeah. And I mean, also by having designated spaces and, you know, schedules of activity, you are conditioning people to want to appreciate art, but then you're also catalyzing artists to keep creating, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because there is a huge motivation factor to art as well. And if you don't have a space to be able to show your art, to be able to present your art, then, you know, that can affect your motivation to be able to want to do things, right? You feel underappreciated. So having the designated space, and then having a schedule of activities that people can count on. They know that, okay, you know, this space is going to have, you know, every weekend some type of activity. You catalyze artists, you condition people into expecting it, and then you create a space of ongoing communication, right? Where artists can do different types of things that not only just present an issue, but then can do follow-up elements of that issue. And I know your art is very much like that. There are separate elements that you can view on its own that make sense completely on its own, but it's all interlinked to additional pieces, right? That tells a whole story, and I feel that really reinforces the message that you're trying to give. All right, so let's take one more question from the audience before we have to wrap up in a little bit. So let's see. All right, so the question is from Rahamat, and it's, I'm a filmmaker, and this is not my field, but is there competitions, various calls from museums and other places that ask for work around the world by artists? If so, then shouldn't there be a fund that people should be able to tap into so they can fully develop their ideas?
Well, more immediately as an artist, from experience, I do tap into the American market more so to do exactly what you're saying, to find a place to exhibit and to find funding to develop these ideas, usually in the form of a residency. And in your filmmaking, you can take the approach of a fine artist and not just limit yourself to describing yourself as a filmmaker alone, but seeing yourself as an artist, and then looking into art opportunities that would do what you're saying. Of course, we would love our individual countries to be able to do that for us, but we are small, and we would continue to push for it to happen. But you also have to be realistic in the times that we are in, and look to outside sources, as well as continue to do what you can do here to find funding and find open calls and so on, to get your work out there.
Yeah, I know that the Barbados Independent Film Festival, an event that Wired also supports, because they have been very much focused on how film can be used as a medium to talk about climate change and to talk about environmental issues and to make people aware and get people moving on the issue. They do have a small grant that they give prior to the festival for local artists to be able to create a short film. And we've had some amazing work come out of the local spectrum here in Barbados through that medium. Of course, it's one event. It's at the beginning of the year. And so there are other spaces, you know, so again, that call to private sector to look at how they can not just see it as a contribution towards art, but a contribution towards art that is a teaching tool, right? A teaching tool. And I mean, you can set the parameters around what you want the artistic expression to be about, you know? So if it is that you are a private sector donor, and you are looking at, you do want to bring about some change, you want to have some kind of advocacy, you feel very strongly about climate change, maybe the thing to do is to think about investing in doing it through art, you know, along with other mediums, but by doing it through art, you may be able to catalyze people to do it otherwise, to do physical stuff. One of the things that came out of our Art for Trees is that we've had so much people after doing the Art for Trees wanting to plant trees, you know? So actually either going home and planting trees, getting together with friends and planting trees, coming to Walker's Reserve and planting trees, and organizations as well also saying, I think I wanna bring to life what I've just put on paper, right? So definitely there's that space for that. So Taisha, as we start to wrap up, we're coming to the end of our time. Are there any last thoughts that you would like to share with us?
I'd just like to reinforce the idea of the role of the individual in facing climate change and climate resilience, and not just the individual artists, but everybody who interacts. Remember that it takes 1 million grains of sand to make the beach, and we can't do it separately. So continue to interact, continue to exchange on small levels, every day, maybe with a coworker, maybe with a friend, maybe with a sibling, but also see how you can play your part on a bigger scale, however that may be, and how you can use art and artists as a conduit to continue to share this message that we really need to get movement on.
Yeah. Excellent. So Taisha, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate sharing the little snippets of your art. I encourage you to visit Taisha's website. We will definitely put the link in the recording so that persons can visit your work and have a dialogue with you. If you have questions for Taisha, she's open to conversation, people.
I love to
you can talk to her. Exactly. Right. And definitely we know that, I think if one thing we've come away from this conversation with is that there is a lot of room for art as a communication medium around climate change and catalyzing that movement on a very personal level for climate resilience. If you missed today's session, you can catch it again on Wired and CPRI's Facebook pages. You can go to Wired's YouTube page. And as of next week, we will also be streaming directly to Wired's YouTube page. So you don't have to wait. Exactly. We're figuring things out, right? We're figuring things out as we go along. We've been listening to persons. They've been saying, can you, I'm not connected to Facebook. Can you stream it on another platform? So yeah, we figured out how to stream it simultaneously on the Facebook pages and on the YouTube page. And next week, on Tuesday the 5th, please join Jen from CPRI as she chats with Ursula Artman. Taisha, I encourage you to join us. I think you would really enjoy this segment on how syntropic farming is changing the face of agriculture in the Caribbean. It's a different type of regenerative agriculture. It's fairly new to the scene, but it has been yielding, pun intended, great fruit. All right. And on Thursday, you can join me again as I talk to Dr. Sonia Peter about everything plants. We look at why biodiversity matters and planting for the future. So Taisha, thank you once again. It's been great having you. And guys, make sure you check out her website. Be safe and see you guys next week.